Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Good. That's always a good start. Yeah, so this is a talk at CSS Day, and I'll warn you, there's not much CSS. It's also a talk about responsive design, and there's not actually much to do with responsive design as we might traditionally think about it. So prepare yourselves. So yeah, I'm at a conference talking about web design, so the first image that I must place on the screen is that of an Apple Watch. You know, I'm sure many of you watched the keynote the other day. I didn't. I can't watch them anymore. And sort of that sort of fascination we have, that sort of I don't know, devices being at the focus of our attention is where I want to start. In his article, The Web's Grain, Frank Camero remarked that technology only adds more. It is never this or that. It is always this and that. And I don't think I've ever read an article where like a sentence has jumped out at me so much and I've gone, that perfectly encapsulates my feelings. I read the other day that we pick up our phones an average of 221 times a day and spend about 3.25 hours of our waking day looking at our phones. And I wonder how much of those interactions we have with our phones and smartwatches, how many of those interactions actually of value. Smartwatches sort of promise to remove that distraction, so instead of picking up our phone, it's more of a glance. But I'm not entirely convinced by the argument. If I'm being slightly cynical, I think the problem smartwatches solve is increasing shareholder value, but that might be just me being a tired old socialist. But yeah, has our obsession with devices, both as an industry and just as humans, become a little bit too much of a distraction? A distraction maybe from more important things. So there's this politically agreed figure of 2 degrees Celsius, which is, it's deemed to be how much more the planet can warm before we face disastrous consequences from climate change. I mean, it's a politically agreed figure, sort of based in science. I was reading actually that the figure goes from like just prior to when we became industrialized. And since then, the temperature has risen by 0.8 degrees Celsius. And computer models predict actually that if we stop generating carbon now, stop today, we'd still produce another 0.8, or temperature would still rise another 0.8 degrees, just because of all the carbon trapped in the atmosphere and just the perpetual warming. Scientists actually predict that by the end of the century, the planet will warm up to 4, maybe 5, 6 degrees. I heard at the G7 meeting earlier this week, leaders agreed to stop burning fossil fuels by 2100. I contend that date is probably a bit too late to fix that particular issue. Okay, so I can feel a bit of tension in the room. Why are you talking about climate change at a conference about CSS? I quite like the idea of that, just get you all bit, have I come to the right place? Don't worry, you have. This is CSS Day. But I'm going to talk to you today about principles, and I don't think I can really do that without discussing some of my own thoughts and feelings. I really like this quote: "Software, like all technologies, is inherently political. Code inevitably reflects the choices, biases, and desires of its creators." So some of my choices and biases. I like to live sustainably. I think we should build products that last where we can. I'm generally of the opinion that we should have fewer screens in the world, not more. It might be a bit of a losing battle. And I like to prioritize people over any particular device. We talk a lot about an Internet of Things. We don't really talk too much about an Internet of People, an Internet of empowered people. Thankfully, my choices align quite well with sort of principles and beliefs behind the web. And I guess that's why I enjoy being part of this industry. At the opening ceremony of the Olympic Games in London 3 years ago, Tim Berners-Lee projected these 4 words: "This is for everyone," which is a pretty clear statement of intent. He later expanded on this in an article for Scientific American, and he said, the web's primary design principle is universality. It should be accessible from any kind of hardware that can connect to the internet, stationary or mobile, small screen or large. So this universality or universal access is basically the web's killer feature. And I'm sure maybe today, certainly in wider discussion, we've been talking about web v native. When are we not having that debate? But this is really like native platforms by their very nature cannot compete on these terms of that universal access. And it's something we should embrace. So, of course, responsive web design gets us a little bit closer to that vision. Let's just refresh ourselves with what responsive web design is. As defined by Ethan Marcotte, it was basically 3 simple techniques combined to produce something much greater. So just fluid grids, flexible images, and media queries. That's responsive web design. It's easy to get caught up in all this responsive discussion, but I think it's worth recognizing that that's just what it is, really. It's just a tool, an approach to front-end development that we can use within a suite of other tools we can use for developing websites. But it's not like the others, because if you've built responsive websites, you'll know that it opens so many questions. It's like a kimono box. We have to start engaging researchers, content strategists, even clients in trying to figure out how the hell do we... It's all coming back to me. In fact, not since the move away from table-based layouts and web standards has there been such a radical realignment of both thought and practice. Given this upheaval that our industry has seen, I think we kind of collectively needed to tell ourselves that this was the right approach, that this was worthy of continued investment, continued investigation. We looked at the first website and went, brilliant. We were right all along. Slight minor diversion through the spacer GIFs and table layouts, but no, this is definitely the approach to take. And while this first humble exercise in HTML has responsive characteristics, its layout responds to the width of the viewport. It doesn't use media queries, doesn't include any images, it doesn't really have a grid. I mean, maybe you could say it has a single column grid at a stretch. I'm not sure. So by definition, it's not responsive, or at least responsive with a capital R. But there is something about this website that I find quite magical, actually. The fact that it's endured. All right, it did kind of disappear for a while, and then they revived it, but ignore that. You can still, use it on today's devices as much as the device that created it 20, 25 years ago. The content might not be relevant so much anymore, certainly from I don't suggest you go to this website to learn how to do HTML, but from a historical perspective, it's really interesting. And that content is still accessible today. I just find that, I don't know, again, that's sort of why I'm in this business. It sort of speaks to things that I'm interested in, that sustainable quality. So on the one hand, we have this strict definition of responsive design, fluid grids, fluid images, and media queries. And yet, we also have lots of websites that we can kind of talk about being responsive maybe, or have that sort of responsiveness to them. We're also starting to talk about responsive typography, responsive content, responsive X. Performance is increasingly part of the discussion, as it should be. We're now trying to work out how to make responsive websites responsive. We're running out of words. We need another word beyond responsive, I think. But if a site has a fluid layout, but requires 20 megabytes of assets before you can view it, is that really responsive? So last year, on this very stage, in fact, Ethan spoke a little bit about principles as well, which is, inspired this talk. He went on to talk about perhaps we need a framework to model the discussions we're having, but a framework not about execution, but about philosophy and quality. we could use this perhaps as a reference point to judge the appropriateness of our work and judge its quality. I really, really like this idea. I think there's something in that. So perhaps foolishly, I'm going to attempt to do that today. So I believe we can start the beginnings, start approaching this framework by thinking about a set of design principles. You may be familiar with the concept of design principles. Organizations like Google and Facebook use them to describe the characteristics of their products and organizations. And yes, I'm surprised as well as you are, I'm sure, that Facebook apparently has principles. I had to say it. Kate Rutter describes design principles as short, insightful phrases that act as guiding lights and support the development of great product experiences. Design principles enable you to be true to your users and true to your strategy over the long term. And again, if we think about what our long-term strategy is for the web, it's that universal access. Remember, this is for everyone. So any principles we create need to be in service of this grander vision. And I think they need to address three primary concerns. The nature of the medium, the desires of those who use it every day, and maybe being a little bit selfish, the requirements of us, the people that build the web. So to judge the suitability of the principles I'm going to present today, I've sort of reflected a bit on the discussion that's taken place over the last 5 years. And I'm also going to share a few examples from my own experience. So let's begin. So, designing something that can be accessed by anybody, everybody, anywhere, anytime, it's a pretty tall order. And perhaps it's not surprising where you even begin to start doing that has confounded opinion. And this is the concern of our first principle. In 2009, Luke Wabluski put forward the case for mobile first. This was to think about the characteristics and capabilities of mobile devices and think about how experiences might manifest themselves there before we even start to think about the desktop. This was partly driven by the explosive growth of mobile, but it also had a side benefit. Luke wrote that losing 80% of your screen space forces you to focus. There simply isn't room for any interface debris or content of questionable value. You need to know what matters most. So often when we do mobile first thinking, we undertake prioritization exercises. We make decisions about what parts of an interface are critical, which are not. Those non-critical parts we may load later, perhaps conditionally. Also, options on the table, we just don't load that stuff at all. Maybe it doesn't have enough value. But Luke wrote that article in 2009, so 6 years later, is it still relevant? He wrote it when smartphone market was still developing, really. Screens were much smaller, lower resolution. Today, if you look at phones, they're just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. They're getting faster as well. The processors that power them are, quite capable now. We've got tablets, which is like a third type of device class. So really, the definition of mobile has become increasingly vague. Another tenet of mobile first was to recognize the capabilities mobiles have, so like all these extra sensors, location, multi-touch, etc. So if we're looking for a proxy for constraint, I think mobile may have been spoiling us. So of course, back to smartwatches, it might be tempting to say we think, watch first. And I have a bit of a sneaky suspicion as soon as Safari lands on the Apple Watch, we'll all be talking about watch first thinking and designing for that. Even though you can browse websites on watches already, it's not until Apple does something that is deemed to be worth pursuing, it seems. But anyway, thinking about our interfaces just purely from that perspective of the screen, I think it's a little bit misguided. After all, not all devices have displays, and visual affordances quite often alone don't suffice. So to build a truly accessible and universal web, I think we need to look beyond visual design. Perhaps we shift our attention away from the devices and look instead at the network and make that our primary constraint. And this is the thinking behind offline first. This takes into account that networks are often either not present, not very reliable, and sort of designed from that position upwards. And as much as I like this approach, I think it's more concerned with robustness and reliability than perhaps adaptability, which is a slightly different focus from what we're looking at today. So maybe we start with content. After all, for years we repeated the mantra that content is king, before then drawing rectangles and pouring in lorem ipsum. But given that today, as we're designing responsive sites, interfaces, they have to adapt to the available screen real estate, content has become like the one aspect of our products that is relatively consistent. And so we've come to rely on it a little bit. Mark Bolton went as far to suggest that we design from the content out rather than the canvas in. But however much we would love to start designing websites with all the content in place, I think we all know that's a pretty unreasonable requirement. I don't think I've ever been on a project where the content's been there from day one. And perhaps that's how it should be. Mark later clarified his position, in fact, to suggest that we consider structure first, content always. And this is thinking about evaluating the sort of content we need and the structure it will take, the tasks it needs to perform, the information it needs to convey, etc. But we can then create some or use some content that is representative of the final form, even if it's not the final content. At the same time, we can work with our clients to help them create that final deliverable. So I think this focus on content is broadly right. And if we're thinking about content, maybe we can think about starting in text, using a sort of text-first approach. This is something advocated by our very own Stephen Hay. He wrote that there's only one type of content that can be viewed on virtually any web-enabled device, and that is plain text, or rather, plain text that has been structured with HTML. Now, when you think the other types of media we can embed into a web page, like images, you should be providing alternative text for those. Images can have written transcripts. Thinking from the perspective of text and content first can actually help us build products that are accessible from the very start. I've been taking this thinking a little bit further by looking at sort of conversation-first design. This is to look at an interface and think of it as more of a conversation. So what questions might a user be asking, and how would I structure the responses to those questions? So let's imagine, very simple example, but an article reviewing a film. A key piece of information here is the rating the reviewer gave, of course. And with our graphic design hat on, we may go, okay, yeah, easy, that's 5 stars. Maybe we fill in the stars for the actual rating for that film. And we might mark it up as such. This markup is actually taken from a website in the UK. I was quite dismayed to see this. Unsurprisingly, it's not very accessible. Star number 1, star number 2, star number 3. It doesn't really say a lot about, if you were trying to get that information from a screen reader, perhaps it wouldn't tell you very much about the review. But if we were to think of this page as a conversation instead, a user might ask, how is this movie rated? And our answer can be as follows. This movie is rated 3 out of 5 stars. Now we can add some additional markup, which allow us to add visual embellishment. So here I've added some empty spans, which we can use as styling hooks. We might even choose to inject this HTML later on. I've added some ARIA attributes to ensure these aren't parsed by accessibility software as well. And again, this is a really simple example. I'm not pretending that this is advanced in any way, but just from this, I think you can start to see that there's this sort of layered experience going on. We've got a piece of content that allows for a degree of enhancement. So, our first principle is as follows. Start from a position that makes few assumptions about context and interface, and instead focus on the information users wish to acquire and the tasks they wish to accomplish. Okay, so we're probably, all of us in this room, are frustrated quite often by sort of the fluidity and unpredictability of the device landscape we need to design and build for. I share that frustration, but I think it's important to recognize that this is only really a reflection of the diversity of the users that are using our websites. You know, it's consumers exercising their right to choice. This is a vegetable peeler. Again, you are at a CSS conference, don't worry. This was designed by Sam Farber, a veteran of the kitchenware business in 1990. And it came about as he spotted an opportunity when he saw his wife, Betsy, an arthritis sufferer, was having real trouble using sort of horrible, really rigid metal vegetable peeler. So he prototyped a number of different handle designs, trying to create one with a more comfortable grip that gave her the level of control she needed. And perhaps unsurprisingly, those without arthritis enjoyed using this design as well, and the peeler went on to win many design and innovation awards. In fact, Sam went on to form a company called OXO in the United States, which is a consumer goods company founded on the principles of universal design. They say that when all needs are taken into consideration in the design process, the result is a product that can be used by the broadest spectrum of users. In the case of OXO, it means designing products for young and old, male and female, left and right-handed, and many with special needs. So, universal design. This has far greater recognition in sort of architecture and product design fields, but I think it can apply just as equally to products built with pixels. And when you look at some of the principles of universal design, they include recommendations like eliminate unnecessary complexity, minimize repetitive actions, and arrange information consistent with its importance. So when you start to look at these principles for accessible design, we realize that accessible design is just good design, full stop. I think you can sort of see a little sort of creeping in of universal design principles in some of the specifications that we use when building the web. One of my favorite parts of the HTML5 specification deals with how authors of that spec should assess additions or changes to it, and it's called the priority of constituencies. And this states that in case of conflict, consider users over authors, over implementers, over specifiers, over theoretical purity. And I think that priority is something we could use in our own work as well. I mean, too often we see choices made that appear to prioritize developer convenience over user experience. I needn't really go into too much detail about front-end MVC JavaScript frameworks. I don't know the audience well enough to know how well I'd get away with saying bad things about things like Angular and Ember, but I know the conference organizer, so I think I'll be safe. But I think it's important to recognize why choices like this are made, and I think it's because there's a sort of an empathy gap. There's a chasm of misunderstanding, and empathy, basically, between two of those constituents, users, and ourselves, authors. Quite often we'll be sitting at nice, large Apple displays, maybe in lovely, cozy offices with our super fast broadband connection. In that environment, it'd be quite difficult to visualize perhaps a user using the product we're designing, on a mobile, perhaps with a really flaky 3G connection. So, of course, user-centered design, that's one of the reasons we do that, is to help us get an understanding of the needs and desires of users and try and understand whether we're serving their needs or not. Also, involving clients in the design process, we can learn about their requirements, but we can also learn or get insights that they've gleaned from having worked with those customers for several years. And in fact, involving different disciplines, developers and researchers, and our clients in the design process, you get a shared learning and a shared understanding, and that empathy hopefully spreads throughout the team. Also, I think collaboration can, if done right, can sort of generate a collective responsibility for the work we're doing. So everyone knows the importance of performance, everyone knows the importance of accessibility, and they're considered like key attributes of a product we're building, not something that's left to the day before it ships or perhaps even afterwards. There's also another aspect, I think, of effective collaborative teams that is often overlooked. In her article, Universal Design in Real Life, Sarah said, "The best way to understand the audiences we design for is to know those audiences. And the best way to know people is to have them with all their differences of perspective and background, and yes, age and gender and race and language too, right alongside us." So if there's, beyond responsive design, if there's another sort of common theme from the last 5 years, I think it's this sort of growing acknowledgement of sort of monoculture that we operate in, sort of very white, young, male-dominated. I was kind of blind to it for a long time as well, but once somebody points it out to you, it gets a little bit weird, I think. And I think diversity in our industry is a problem that is worth fixing, not least because it might help us build better products, but also just because we want to be nice people. So how can we incorporate universal design principles into some of the work we do? On a recent project, early on in sort of getting up to speed with it, we were sort of taken through some of the usability testing that was done, and it was pointed out that quite a number of users, sort of middle-aged, older demographic, so had poor eyesight. So immediately we're like, well, we need to take that into account. We need to think about maybe having larger font sizes, etc. But when it came to creating user personas, all of that thinking has sort of disappeared. And somebody on the team pointed this out. It's like, why are we not featuring sort of any sort of, talking about accessibility in this tool? So it started a bit of a discussion, and we thought about maybe you could create a separate persona, maybe, sort of disabled persona. But these need to be grounded in reality and research. So, if you were to just create a single persona with sort of, disabled characteristics, I think it would be quickly and easily dismissed. Oops. So instead, I think we can enhance our existing personas, perhaps by giving them short-term disability concerns that sort of represent other accessibility issues. So a persona could have recently broken their wrist in a skiing accident, so they have temporary restriction in that area. Another user, maybe, we all do this, using the phone in bright sunlight, trying to shade it, cover it over. That's kind of equivalent to perhaps having poor eyesight. Maybe another persona, they live in a loud household, kids running around screaming, so they've probably got, a degree of hearing loss, maybe actually, or at least seems like it at times. So that's our second principle, that the web is accessed by users with individual needs and desires. Multidisciplinary and inclusive teams working together have a better chance of reflecting that diversity. Okay, so on to our third and final principle. And I suspect this one is a bit more aimed at this particular audience, but I thought it was important to get all the principles together so you can see how they work. And this is about building systems that can be reasoned with. So previously, all you needed to build a website was a text editor, maybe Notepad, a basic understanding of CSS and HTML. Today, you need to understand, well, sometimes I think I need a computer science degree to start working on a project. And I know HTML, I know CSS, I know some JavaScript, not enough maybe, but sometimes I just look at some projects and think, wow, I need to go back to school. So how we navigate this elaborate landscape is the concern of this third principle. We're seeing a growing use of automation within front-end development. It's quite easy perhaps to be dismissive of these tools, but they have many benefits, of course. So preprocessors, they allow us to modularize our CSS and use long requested features like variables and constants. Testing our code for errors helps us build more robust products. And of course, optimizing assets makes those products faster. Now, some view this sort of, rush to automate everything as maturity, and others view it as madness. And whether we become too reliant on these tools, I think that's open to debate. I think that's a discussion worth having. And it's worth recognizing that while there are these benefits, they do come at a cost. And that cost is complexity. I'm broadly comfortable with this move towards a more engineering-like approach to front-end development, away from any previous notions of craft, certainly when working on bigger projects and in larger teams. But I think it's really important that we sort of recognize the trajectory we're on. By introducing a succession of tools into our workflow, it's making it harder for other members of our teams to collaborate, especially if these tools sort of assume a pre-existing level of knowledge. You need to understand like the Unix file system before you can start building a website. It's not particularly helpful. SAS, we'll hear a bit about that today. I think at its best, SAS works as a really nice interface between designers and developers. It means we can have this shared language, these shared names from both in terms of design, right through to code, through to production. And I think SAS can work really well in that respect. But at worst, it turns a declarative language into a programming language. And I think it's important to remember why CSS was designed the way it was designed. Partly it's for making it accessible to designers. So our second principle, our previous principle, talked about having empathy with our users. And in many regards, this third principle is an extension of that, except this time the user is not somebody using our product, but it's somebody who's on our team. Susan Robertson recently wrote about some ways she likes to work when she starts with a new team. She had some really good advice in this particular article, actually, but she said, empathy is just as much about our interactions with each other as it is about how we treat our users. So while this complexity, to a degree it may be unavoidable, we should certainly seek to reduce the opacity of the systems we're building. Because I think if we don't, we really risk losing the opportunity to collaborate with other people, other disciplines. This works both ways, of course. So previously thinking a little bit more how developers can make their systems open to designers, but designers need to make their work accessible to developers as well. And one practice gaining momentum is the creation of style guides. Now, I find this development really, really exciting. Not often because it's quite fun to see how a site is put together behind the scenes, but it kind of suggests there's a maturing relationship between the two disciplines. It also suggests that there's sort of an agreed understanding now that we can't really get away with designing static comps, that we need to think in terms of fluid components that adapt to different variables and work as part of a broader system. Now, modular design is a widely accepted software engineering practice. In fact, Tim Berners-Lee in his Principles of Good Design noted that modular design and being part of a modular design were necessary principles. Modular design often invokes principles like don't repeat yourself, single responsibility principle, etc. And these have been advocated for a number of years now by the likes of Nicole Sullivan and Harry Roberts. And I think it's worth noting how they arrived at those recommendations. They didn't just come out of thin air and thought we should do it all like this now. It was having worked with big teams. It was through having to work with other people that they arrived at these practices. We can debate the pros and cons of this more engineering-led approach, but there are benefits. Having reusable classes makes for more robust, maintainable systems that are hopefully easier to understand. Naming methodologies like BEM they not only make it easier to understand what a particular class does, but from my own point of view, it just makes it much easier to choose names. That alone, I think, sold it for me. I don't know, maybe today we'll hear a bit of a debate about BEM and different systems that we're using, but when I talk to people about BEM, a lot of people get caught up on like, oh yeah, it involves using double hyphens or underscores, or I don't like the way a particular classes get written using that methodology. Well, first of all, I'd say understand the reasons why this approach exists, why it's been created. And remember, you're free to adapt it and change it to your own needs. This stuff isn't written in stone. So understand the motivations, try and work out what's going on, and then adapt it to your own tastes. Perhaps we should go back to the priority of constituents that we had earlier and note that we should consider authors over theoretical purity. So last year, Jeremy Keith and Anna Debenham worked on a project for Code for America, and Jeremy wrote extensively about it, but one of the most interesting posts he wrote was about some refactoring they undertook. Originally, they used a very sort of object-oriented approach to their CSS, but the code that was being delivered to Code for America was actually being used by their volunteers that had a more basic understanding of front-end development. So adding all this complexity to HTML, adding all these classes, was actually hindering their ability to create pages. So Jeremy and Anna refactored it, taking this into account. And Jeremy reflected on this. He said, it's worth remembering while we're aiming for maintainability in what we write. It's not for any technical reason, it's for people. And if the priority for those people is to have simple HTML, then more complex CSS may be an acceptable price to pay. So, it depends. That famous get out. And I think I tend to think of it, it's like, yeah, sure, it depends, but I need an answer. It depends it's a bit too fuzzy. But I think we can actually get away with using it depends a bit more liberally than we'd otherwise allow ourselves. Because if we're designing componentized systems, these components are kind of self-contained. Maybe we can just, for each component, we can choose the approach that is most appropriate for that component. So we needn't get into arguments about whether object-oriented CSS is the right approach or not, or whether we should be using a BEM methodology or embracing the cascade. It depends. So let's look at an example of this. Let's take a page, and for each component, identify its role. Does it convey information? Perhaps it's got sort of document-like attributes. Is it used to perform a task? Perhaps has application-like attributes? Or is it just part of the navigation, part of the interface, like providing things like navigation? We can then choose the appropriate approach to CSS depending on the concerns of each component. So this is the BBC News website. It doesn't really matter what particular website we're looking at, but we can broadly divide it into different concerns. So you've got interface elements like the primary navigation. So these sort of parts of an interface, they're probably determined by a design team who have a lot of control over how it looks, how it works, how it's written, and it probably doesn't change that often. Content, on the other hand, it's a bit of a black box. Maybe it's coming out of a CMS or from a third-party API. So generally what's in there is a bit more fluid and unpredictable. So clearly we've got these different requirements going on. It would be mad not to think of approaching them in slightly different ways. So for our navigation, we might use object-oriented approach. We might use utilities like clearfix and object patterns like list, and a BEM naming methodology. But for our content, we may just want to give it a containing class and then style all the descendant selectors directly. So having these different approaches to CSS within the same system, I think is fine. It depends. But there is a problem with this. And if you've got multiple different approaches happening within the same system, you're sort of introducing a degree of fragility. We might get all this great flexibility, but one of the most important aspects of of a system is that people contributing to it can understand what's going on. After all, code is read more often than it's changed. So where we can document, or even better still, self-document our code, all for it. So I've been looking at using namespaces in my CSS classes, and this is something that Harry Roberts wrote about. He said a namespace will tell us exactly how classes behave in a more global sense. A namespace tells us exactly what a class or suite of classes does in non-relative terms. And he goes into really great detail in his post. It's like 3,000 or 4,000 words, and he suggests about 9 different namespaces that he tends to use. I'll cover just a few here. So we've got like the object namespace, and this is for reusable structural objects. I think you could, if you want to sort of align these with a sort of engineering principle, perhaps this is don't repeat yourself. Components, implementation-specific pieces of UI. This is, the basis of modular design. Utility classes, again, these provide a single specific role, so that's kind of single responsibility principle going on. And we've got these scope selectors, which contain HTML, which is perhaps be liberal in what you receive. I'm on really dangerous territory because I'm not a software engineer, so have I got away with that? So if we return to our earlier example, you can see how by adding these namespaces, you can kind of read the code a little bit better. Here we're saying our navigation component uses the list object pattern and a clear fix utility. And we update the content and our styles as such. I think we can also take that it depends approach to images as well. Discussion of responsive images has largely focused on how best to serve them given the size of viewport. But it's rarely focused, I think, on the different types of imagery that we use on the web. Not all images are created equal. So thinking in a more modular way, we might look at different images and what they provide. So interface elements, they tend to be more vector-based perhaps, more iconography, supplementing or replacing text labels. So we might use SVG or icon fonts. Images that convey information. I think a good way to know if an image should be on a page is if you can provide meaningful alt text. So here, Angela Merkel and Francis Hollande shaking hands. And perhaps you just use an image or maybe the picture element. A lot of imagery on the web is largely decorative. Maybe it adds some visual affordances, makes the design more beautiful to look at, etc. But these images don't actually provide any information. If you're using stock imagery, I'd suggest that probably doesn't say a lot. So maybe we inject these later with JavaScript or we use CSS backgrounds or something like that. There's also a fourth option, and that's just to not include images at all. And I think it's an option we should be using more often. First principle of keynote presentations, by the way, is there's always a legitimate reason to use the flame transition effect. That's a different talk. But I think it's also, just on this point, important to recognize that images, the same image, may find itself under a different categorization. So in the UK, you often see images like this on news stories about jobs, and you see a picture of a job centre sign or what have you, just to say basically, hey, this is a story about jobs, but it doesn't really, that image in of itself doesn't convey any information. But if that was on the job centre website, perhaps maybe discussing the brand, then that image would be far more important. So this is our third principle. Given the complexity of the technology we use to build the web, aim to keep things simple. We can achieve this by building modular systems made up of discrete, self-documented components that can be adapted and improved over time. Okay, so to recap. We're working in this really unpredictable medium where we can't really make too many assumptions about the device capabilities, the context of use, etc. So by starting from a foundation that makes few assumptions, we can hopefully better deal with that landscape. Through research and user-centered design, we can get to know our users better. But the better way to get to know our users is to reflect their diversity within our own teams. And again, by having some empathy, not just for our users, but for members of our team, we can build products that together, everybody on the team can contribute to and understand. So I think with these 3 principles, you may see there's like a shift in focus away from technology. I haven't really talked too much about devices. Instead, the focus is on users and on people. And I think that's an important issue to take away from this, if anything. Also, these sort of are more about process than application. And I don't think that's by accident. So somebody asked me when I was doing this talk earlier, doing some rehearsals, they're like, why is it not called responsive web design principles? I was like, aha, there's a double meaning to the name responsive principles. Because as much as I've tried to create principles that endure and hopefully some sort of long-lasting value to them, I think the principles themselves also need to be responsive to change. And that's what I encourage you to do. They're online, they're on GitHub, and I really, these aren't set in stone at all. Maybe there's some I've missed, maybe there's some, that need adapting or changing. Please let me know, either on GitHub or by using the hashtag RWD principles. And I look forward to hearing your suggestions. Thank you very much.
Excellent. So step into my office, Paul. And Zoe, if you could come and set up your computer. It's going to be a Mac. Nothing's going to go wrong ever. Now, as somebody who's into sustainability, you might be happy to know that nobody asks questions. So that means no screens. That's good. You lazy, lazy people. That's a lot of high-level stuff, which is good to have about. But what about the issue that it seems to me when we talk about responsive design to end users or to like mid-level companies, yeah, we're using Bootstrap and it's responsive. Or yeah, we're using Polymer and that comes with material design, which is beautiful for every interface out there. Are we running a danger of people just using out-of-the-box systems and call it responsive and not even think about the stuff that we're doing?
I think so, and I think that's possibly why Ethan made that sort of request to start thinking about a framework that is less about like application and more about, like philosophy and quality. Yeah, it does look like quite often we're looking for those shortcuts, and sometimes that might be the right approach. But again, by shifting the focus, and that's kind of what's going on with these principles, is there is a subtle shift in focus there, going from the concerns of particular specifications, technologies, devices, etc., and thinking about what we're actually meant to be delivering at the end of the day. It's not about we're delivering a Bootstrap-powered website. It's about, addressing a particular need. And I think our focus on technology, and as much as we are excited about that, I mean, that's what we do, that's our bread and butter, it does have that sort of, it does abstract us away, I think, from what we're ultimately delivering.
What I found interesting was the BBC side that with all our best practices that came from the days of old when I was young and still had my hair, about like content separation from behavior, from structure. And content is a black box that comes from a content management system. Isn't it partly also our fault that over the years we didn't care about content management systems and how people put content on the web?
Yeah, I mean, that's equally as much as part of delivering a product, or should be, as like how it gets delivered to users. Again, there's maybe not an empathy gap, just a complete ignorance or ignoring one set of users. Like the users who use a content management system are just as important as those that end up seeing the content. Now, when I was at The Guardian, as well as launching a new website, they also recreated and built a new CMS, partly because of responsive design concerns, delivering all this content to different devices. The previous CMS was very rigid in its approach and tied to a particular implementation. But that was equally as much of part of delivering that work as was delivering the website.
Especially at The Guardian, because I work with that as well. What I loved is that all the content was available as a feed as well, just by changing the URL. Do you think that is part of a responsive responsibility and design as well?
Well, so The Guardian has a content API, and that was really useful for them because they could create the native apps from that. They could create the responsive website alongside the new the current website. There's adaptability and flexibility in just having your content, that separation of concerns, isn't it? So by having content in a way that's abstracted from any particular implementation, that's the definition of adaptive, really, isn't it?
I mean, we're running out of time, but one thing, when I looked at the last example with the namespacing of CSS and the BEM classes, aren't we reinventing XML and CSS with that? Because they had namespaces, they had all kind of like controls.
Yeah, I mean, XML wasn't all bad. Maybe it's getting a bit of a bad rap, but these all come from the same place. The software engineering principles, which I know only a little about. I feel like I'm on very dangerous ground. But those haven't been invented in the last 5 years. Those have come from like 20, 30, 50 years of people building software. So I think there's actually value in learning from what people have done before us.
So going back to the people we try to replace with the web. Excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you.